In my educational and nostalgic videos, I've been talking about various game consoles and unfairly left out personal computers. And they could boast quite a lot of big and beloved games as well. Of course, you could also play a shooter or even a strategy using a console, but could the joystick ever compete with mouse and a keyboard? So today, we're going to fix that and indulge the PC master race with this one video. Okay, from the top, these are personal computers we're talking about, and we've been using them for playing games longer than any console. The first computers appeared back in the 50s, but those were heavy machines, not exactly suitable for gaming. However, that didn't stop enthusiasts in 1961 from making the first computer game called Space War. Then computers moved into households thanks to the efforts of Apple. Later, there were computers from IBM that used Intel architecture, and then came 1993 that brought us
the Intel Pentium processor.
Popularization of computer games began a bit earlier, for which we have to thank the guys from ID Software. But in general, it'll be safe to say that PC gaming as we know it appeared somewhere in the early 90s. And since I've just mentioned ID Software, it would be unfair not to start today's video with the legendary Doom. Born in distant 1993, this shooter has left such a great mark on the industry that I can hardly add anything to everything that has already been said about it. Doom brought us multiplayer battles, first speedruns, and of course, countless hours of demon slaying. The game's popularity allowed it to receive an unfathomable number of ports, so if you'd like to make an acquaintance with this chapter of the game dev industry, you'll be able to do so regardless of the platform that you're using, let it be a printer or an ATM. Those who remember the dawn of the first Doom should also remember that before Doom, ID Software was developing Wolfenstein 3D, the basis of which helped in the making of the Martian Demon Slayer. The game told the story of an American scout who got imprisoned in the Nazi castle Wolfenstein, then decided to escape and defeat Hitler on his way out. The game didn't spark such a hysteria as Doom. After all, it is only a predecessor, but this was not because of the game's poor quality. ID Software were simply making their first steps.
Good morning and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System. This automated train is provided for the security and convenience of the Black Mesa Research Facility personnel.
Continuing with the topic of legendary shooters, it is worth mentioning Half-Life. I'm sure that almost all of our viewers are familiar with the adventures of Gordon Freeman, the silent physicist. The game's success was ensured by a fairly captivating story which was developing throughout the whole game, not just in the manual, and the gameplay that was more than just run and gun, and actually made you turn on your brain. The sequel, naturally, went even further and amplified strong suits of the original game. After Half-Life, there was much less desire to play storyless shooters. Unless, of course, they had multiplayer. And Half-Life had it as well. However, much more often we would play one particular Half-Life mod called Counter-Strike. Back in the day, as well as now, we would divide into terrorists and counter-terrorists and then fight to accomplish the map's objective. The game became insanely popular thanks to its distribution in internet cafes. Its peers were Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament. We'll get them next time. However, when juxtaposed to these games' plasma guns and monsters, Counter-Strike stood out for its realistic action. After all, shooting pistols and AKs was more comfortable, I guess. These games really put in demand shooters of all kinds. For example, they gave birth to the Battlefield franchise. Many fell in love with the series since the very first game that was called Battlefield 1942. The gameplay consisted of capturing control points on the battlefield, hence the title. These points allowed players to respawn and provided them various sorts of military machinery. Both teams also had a number of soldiers, which was spent when respawning and diminished if the team had fewer points under control than the enemy team. Losing all the soldiers meant a defeat. This provided a great field for tactical decisions, and the battles gained unprecedented epicness and immensity. This was complemented by a great soundtrack, where the main theme was a thing of its own. It's worth mentioning that this wasn't the first World War II shooter, but Battlefield 1942 had certainly pushed the genre forward. For example, it gave birth to the famous Call of Duty franchise, which is also worth talking about, but the time is limited and there are way too many videos about this series already, so there's no need to plow the sands. There were so many shooters that it would take hours to list them all. Just to name a few: Medal of Honor, which appeared on PCs since Allied Assault and gave us some of the most unusual missions of the time; Serious Sam, the first encounter, where we would eliminate hordes of aliens and then have nightmares about the bomb kamikaze screams; the first Far Cry, which had so much content and such a vast in-game world that it was distributed on as much as 4 discs. And of course, the legendary Stalker, the shooter about the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. Unusual story, realistic AI, and unique ambience made this game truly one of a kind. We'll get back to the shooters, but for now, let's switch to another gaming genre: strategies. Here, there were also plenty of games to choose from, and we might as well start from another creation from the developers of Stalker, the Cossacks series. Somehow it managed to combine somewhat arcade gameplay and very believable recreations of the 17th century battles. It also boasted a large number of nations with their own special troops. For example, I often played as Poland because of their really sick looking winged hussars. Then there was Total War, which on one hand was quite similar to Cossacks, yet it couldn't be more different. Unlike Cossacks, it felt much more tactical and turn-based. Here, you had to keep track of your troops, strengths and weaknesses, and take advantage of various military tricks like flanking your enemy or capturing high grounds. Each game of this series told the story of a different era, which put it one line with Cossacks. Yet Total War's approach was more historical. And since we're talking about TBS strategies, it would be a crime not to mention Heroes of Might and Magic. Players like me used to play the first and the second parts of the series. Those who were younger played the fifth part, but most often the phrase "Let's play Heroes" would mean the third part of the franchise. It stood out for great graphics, a wide variety of races, characters, artifacts, etc. And the majestic soundtrack, of course. In terms of gameplay complexity, the third Heroes were somewhat between the previous 2 games of the series. Everything was quick and fun, yet with a grain of tactical thought you could turn the tables with one witty move. A built-in map generator and the ability to play together on one computer made for insane replayability. Because of this, dozens and hundreds of hours were spent in matches that we will certainly finish later. But most of the time, we'd play real-time strategies. For example, Command & Conquer, the first game of this series, became the founding father of the genre by developing the ideas that first appeared in the good old Dune 2. Here we have even more asymmetrical sides of the conflict, and the classic economy model for the later RTS games, where a soldier costs almost as much as the building that produces him, while the campaigns present the story through different missions. By the way, one of the series' advantages were the live-action clips used in these campaigns. It's fair to say that these very clips made CNC seem so epic and funny at the same time. Yet, a special niche in the genre has always been occupied by the ideological rivals of Command & Conquer, the strategies from Blizzard. The first one was called Warcraft: Orcs and Humans. Like CNC, it was largely based on the gameplay of Dune 2 and was a fantasy RTS about a war between humans and orcs, obviously. The second game in the series was essentially the first part, but much better, which secured a good reputation both for Blizzard and the franchise. Notably, the graphics became much more detailed, the missions much more interesting and diverse, and the developers also added a map editor and much more convenient multiplayer. But the real banger was Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos, later complemented by an equally famous add-on, the Frozen Throne. The strategy was now in full 3D, it had 4 different races instead of 2, and most importantly, they added new heroes, who were previously just upgraded versions of the ordinary characters and could only be accessible in campaigns. Now, a hero was an important and powerful addition to the army. Moreover, a hero possessed certain RPG elements like leveling and the ability to carry items. Another honorable mention is the map editor, which allowed you to make any game on the base of Warcraft, let it be Tetris or some shooter. By the way, the first Dota owes its birth to this editor, where we would play before it all became a standalone game from Valve. And then Warcraft evolved into an MMO RPG, known worldwide as World of Warcraft. Now, we were no longer managing large units, instead, the player had to upgrade his own character. To this end, he had to beat numerous quests, dungeons, and bosses. The game retained the atmosphere of the original title and went on with its plot, so here you could find literally all the locations and characters from the original strategy. WoW is still quite relevant today, so it's not too late to join the exploration of the world of Azeroth. But I must warn you that the good old World of Warcraft about the Wrath of the Lich King and the today's one about the Journey to Shadowlands are basically two different games. It's hard to say which one is better, because everything is getting improved and upgraded, but the first add-ons were still more interesting to play. We'll be talking about it in one of the upcoming videos, so stay tuned. Although, to be fair, even in its current state, World of Warcraft is still capable of keeping you engaged for a solid 100 hours. Speaking of equally addictive games, I can only think of Lineage 2, which, crudely put, had similar gameplay, only with an emphasis on leveling up, rather than on the exploration of the world and its history. Both games also had a PvP mode. In Warcraft, it was more of a duel mode, while in Lineage, a wall-to-wall battle could include up to 500 players, a working way to get in the shoes of a unit from StarCraft.
Hey, you listening to me? Hold on, I got visual. Get the damn boat back! I'm behind the ship!
Speaking of StarCraft, it was an RTS as well, but space-themed. The game was based on the same second Warcraft with enhanced tactical options. The developers managed to implement a completely asymmetric balance here. Instead of two races, they made three unique ones by using the concept from Dune 2 and CNC. The balance turned out to be so great that even today's second StarCraft still counts as an esports discipline. The story campaign was pleasantly surprising, with a whole bunch of cutscenes, briefings before missions, and clips between them. I was particularly impressed with the first StarCraft, because, after all, it was my first PC game. To be honest, even today, I still don't mind playing story campaigns from time to time, especially with the release of a great remaster. Of course, the game had some minor glitches, like the units struggling to find their way from time to time, but the rest of StarCraft was worth turning a blind eye to. Since we're talking about Blizzard, it's worth mentioning Diablo. It was an action RPG about how one of the three heroes would descend into deep dungeons to exterminate the demons, all while doing simple quests and occasionally returning to the surface to hand over tons of loot to the merchant. The game wasn't very dynamic, but even then it offered a very satisfying feeling of fighting numerous enemies. In keeping with the best traditions of the old Blizzard, the sequel made Diablo's strong suits even stronger and fixed its weaknesses. Thanks to that, we got an even more dynamic gameplay, a greatly increased number of weapons and enemies, and most importantly, a variety of locations instead of one big dungeon. Here, we had to explore forests, deserts, and temples of all shapes and sizes. And of course, it's impossible to convey this cascade of emotion that the player felt when entering the depths of hell, where he had to defeat Diablo himself. Speaking of RPGs, I definitely have to mention Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Is the most popular part of the respective vampire game series. Here's the synopsis. Besides humans, there are also vampire clans in our world. They founded an organization called the Camarilla, which is some sort of a secret government. At the start of the game, we found ourselves in Los Angeles in early 2000s, when the protagonist gets turned into a vampire without the Camarilla's permission. The vampire responsible for this crime was executed, while we began the long and arduous path to become a part of the new society. Bloodlines had much more hardcore role-playing system than other games of the genre at the time. As usual, you could level up your character, but in order to gain experience, you had to perform specific actions instead of killing everything on your path. The actions included discovering secret areas, reading books, and completing quests. Completing these quests using stealth or pacifist tactics brought you more experience. What made the game tougher was the necessity to choose one of 7 clans when creating your character, as it would heavily influence the gameplay. For example, vampires from the Nosferatu clan weren't exactly the prettiest, so they had to either choose stealth or scare the in-game characters, while the Malkavian clan constantly had to deal with mental issues, which would result in the protagonist having a conversation with a road sign, for example. Speaking of conversations, the in-game characters were vibrant as hell, and this can be said about both their lines and awesome voice acting. The game also stood out for its story that consisted of truly great quests and multiple endings, excellent graphics for the time, and a soundtrack that popularized a whole number of rock songs. In short, it was such a great game that I am very much looking forward to the already announced second part.
The kingdom of Murtana, united by King Robar II.
There was also a no less interesting action RPG called Gothic. We used to play the first and the second parts of the series for hours on end. They told the story of a nameless hero who in the first game ended up in prison and was trying to get past the magical barrier that surrounded the prison mines, while in the sequel he was dealing with the aftermath of killing the demon who brought down the barrier. Gameplay and progression was more down to earth than in Bloodlines. Complete quests and kill monsters to gain experience and levels. But in return, Gothic would surprise you with unusual little things. Like most games on today's list, Gothic was loved for its interesting story, well-worked in-game world, and great soundtrack. But there were also some surprising features, such as the way of obtaining various loot. The first game began with our protagonist getting knocked down and stripped to the shirt, but with the help of certain skills, we ourselves could do the same thing to other characters. Another peculiarity was the controls. Almost all interactions with the world were done through the active action button, control on the default layout, and the direction of the movement. Need to pick up an item? Control up. Throw it out of the inventory? Control down. Need to talk to someone? Control up. By using the same combination, you could use magic, fight, parry, shoot, and much more. But on the other hand, such controls allowed to implement a decent fencing system, thanks to which the player could actually defeat strong enemies with early weapons and a grain of skill. And of course, everyone who played Gothic knows that the game is actually about parkour on rocks and cliffs. And those who haven't played it yet, better partake the classic. But let's take our minds off of all this role-playing stuff and talk about something more arcade-ish. The first thing that comes to mind is Carmageddon, a tabletop manual for a misanthropic car enthusiast. A truly unique thing, especially by current gaming standards. Remember those moments when you would drive around in GTA and accidentally hit a pedestrian and thought, oh my, how rude and embarrassing, but still a bit fun? Well, Carmageddon took this idea to a whole new level. Colorful animations of pedestrians flying around, bonuses for making the most spectacular and stupid mayhem, and the dark humor that accompanied it all. Oh, I almost forgot. It was also a racing game, and your objective was to be the first to cross the finish line. The car park was as you'd expect, so instead of slick sports cars, you had to drive absolutely insane vehicles covered with blades, spikes, jaw-shaped bumpers, etc. You could even drive an armored bulldozer if you felt like it. Needless to say, thanks to all this, Carmageddon was banned in many countries, and needless to say, it only fueled our interest in the game. A very different kind of simulator was The Sims, which allowed you to play God over one of more personal virtual humans. Simply put, it was a heavily upgraded version of the Tamagotchi. The virtual human, called Sim, would do all sorts of ordinary activities, live in a house, work, eat, sleep, watch TV, and we helped him lead a long and happy life. Or maybe not. Everyone remembers the pool thing, right? Okay, never mind. Each game in the series provided more ways to make the life of your sim happier and more vibrant. And I'll go back to shooters, because there are still a lot of titles to cover. Take Alien Shooter for example. I'm sure many of us have played the first and second parts of the series. It felt like a mixture of Doom and Diablo, allowing you to eliminate hordes of hostile fauna without having to deal with complicated mechanics. However, when you did want to deal with such mechanics, you could launch Hitman, a great stealth shooter that is popular even today. This game taught us that the killer profession is insanely difficult, because each victim of the Silent 47, the game's protagonist, required a unique approach. Somewhere you had to ambush the victim when it was alone. Somewhere you had to go under guise and wait for the right moment. Or you could perform an action to distract the guards, and all that could be on one single level.
They were all dead. The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger, and then it was over.
Another memorable title was Max Payne, a shooter that took a lot from the movie genre, film noir. It fascinated the player with its visuals, cinematography, and of course, its heartfelt story. The game told us about Max Payne, a police officer whose family was killed by a gang of junkies. In order to bring them down and avenge his family, Max joins the DEA and is forced to work undercover. But because of that, his best friend gets murdered right in front of him, and Max becomes the prime suspect. In an attempt to exonerate himself, Payne carries on with his own investigation, and the story starts to take such turns that I strongly recommend you to go play the game yourself, because it's really worth it. The gameplay was hard to match the story. Technically, we had an ordinary corridor shooter, but the setting and the gameplay challenges didn't allow the player to get bored, and everything was diluted with the famous feature called bullet time, which essentially slowed down time. It allowed the player not only to contemplate passing bullets and snowflakes, but also to dodge enemies' bullets, all while sending them lead sandwiches. The graphics only complemented the action, as it was made using photographs of real objects, which were then turned into textures. The second game of the series possessed the same level of staging and elaboration. I'd even praise the third part, despite its questionable decisions.
What the?
You have a message from Mr. Salieri.
What the hell's going on?
Oh no.
Well, that certainly changes the situation, gentlemen. Kill that clown!
The famous Mafia, the City of Lost Heaven, made a similar impression. The story of Tommy Angelo, who unexpectedly starts the career of a mobster, captivates you and doesn't let go, which makes it truly believable. But unlike Payne, it had the charming atmosphere of 1930s America with beautiful music and odd-looking retro cars. No less thrilling was the Fear horror shooter. The game immersed the player into the daily life of the first encounter assault recon unit, tasked with tackling supernatural threats. One of these threats turned out to be an army of clone soldiers which got out of control in a research lab. When the Fear squad arrived on the scene, the protagonist, one of the squad's operatives, started experiencing hallucinations and visions, and most importantly, he started seeing the ghost of a girl whose appearance was a reference to the antagonist from the Ring movie. For its time, the game had some very impressive technology. First of all, of course, the visual effects. All the hallucinations and apparitions looked more than convincing, thanks to which Fear kept the tension no worse than Silent Hill. The game's AI was also astounding, as it not only possessed most of the player's abilities, but also actively opposed him. Enemies took advantage of cover, communicated and cooperated with each other, ambushed the player. Long story short, the only thing that could save the protagonist was his special ability. In game it was called superhuman reflexes, but in fact it just slowed time. Like in Max Payne, only here it was first person. I admit that I missed this game when it was released and got to it just recently, but even now, it doesn't give the impression of something outdated or primitive, so I can surely recommend it. Since we started today's video with Doom, it will only be fair to end it with Crysis. Just like John Carmack's creation, Crysis heavily influenced the FPS genre and in some ways the embodiment of the gaming industry of its time. The plot was rather simple. A race of evil aliens had been dormant on the Philippine Islands since the Ice Age. These islands are captured by Korean troops, and the unit of the US Special Forces is dispatched to deal with the situation. We played as a member of this squad with the call sign Nomad, who possessed a futuristic nanosuit. The suit had a reserve of energy, which was spent on one of 4 modes: armor, which provided strong protection, strength, which allowed to jump high and deal more damage in melee combat, speed and cloak, which are pretty self-explanatory. These abilities allowed to successfully oppose Korean invaders as well as the awakened aliens. When comparing Crysis to its predecessors, there are 2 points worth noting. Firstly, the action here felt much more linear and intense. It can be compared to a roller coaster, where you have tons of fun riding one path, while earlier you had to wander around large maps and explore the surroundings. I won't say that it is for better or for worse, but it certainly felt new. And secondly, Crysis showed us a whole new level of graphics. Everything was made so technologically advanced that at the time of the game's release, there hardly was a PC that could meet its system requirements. But when the components and their price tags finally allowed us to try out this new pioneer in the industry, many players, including myself, were speechless. So that concludes our short tour of what we used to play on our PCs. Of course, there are way more worthy and memorable titles that I managed to cover even in such a hectic video. And I didn't even mention the PC piracy, which, just like on PS1, had so much going on that perhaps we should make a separate video about it. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. Today, I tried to cover everything that I personally remember most vividly, so don't go too harsh on me if I mentioned something very briefly or left out altogether. In return, I will once again invite you to share memories about your favorite PC games in the comment section. And as always, leave a like, smash the bell button, and subscribe for more nostalgic and educational content. Stay tuned.